Welcome out there. My name is Laolu Akonde and you are on to Inside Sources. And here is my take for the week, entitled, Who Will Tell the President Part 2. There are critical concerns that invite the attention of the people, but don't get the focus of the government. So we ask again today, who will tell the president? Who will tell the president that the promise that he made of a living wage for Nigerian workers is still pending? Emphasis is on living wage. And this is especially so now that soaring inflation in our country has made the salaries of workers across board almost valueless. Someone needs to hurriedly whisper into the ears of the president that the 30,000 naira minimum wage of 2019 amounted to $88 then. Today, it is only $23. Now, we note the latest increase in the salaries of civil servants by the federal government, but a firm and timely decision on the minimum wage, which will be a living wage, is still outstanding. Emphasis is on the living wage. So who will tell the president? Who will tell the president that while we are dealing with the issue of petrol scarcity again this week, the NNPC has assured us that there is enough stock in the country to last for a month. But the NMDPRA, the regulators, seem to be dozing off on the wheels. They are refusing, according to news reports, to pay independent petrol marketers the sum of 200 billion naira, which is the outstanding of the bridging claims since February, when the minister directed that this should be paid. And they are threatening that the fuel scarcity will get worse. Who will tell the president that the NMDPRA should promptly do its job and pay the marketers the outstanding bridging claims? We need someone to tell the president urgently so that this fuel scarcity can end quickly. Who will tell the president that the current electricity tariff increase that was announced is not delivering on its promise? Yet our minister, Bayo Adelabu, is threatening all of us that the power sector will collapse without those tariff increase. Is it not obvious that what will destroy the power sector is the unaccountable inefficiencies of some of the discourse and the lack of real investment and poor technical capacity in the sector? What about some of the sabotage in the TCN? And those the real danger to the sector? Who will tell the president that a former power minister in this country came up with the idea of an energy fund to cure the problem of financial liquidity in the power sector? But that minister couldn't even get the attention of a former president to look at the idea. Why won't the incumbent minister reopen the idea instead of threatening us with an on-hand tariff increase? Why should Nigerians pay for services they are not receiving? Mr. President, somebody needs to tell you that this tariff increase is not working. Who will tell the president that we need some radical and innovative ideas in the power sector rather than all these same old moves of increasing tariffs for services not rendered? Who will tell the president that under his watch, every decision and action or statement that creates a negative perception is a dent on his administration? Who will tell the president? Who will tell the president that the communication from the villa to the nation is still a struggle? Actually, the advisors are working very hard, but their coordination is very poor. Finally, we must note some of the worthy steps that we have seen already from the president, including the student loan scheme, whose board is now chaired by Mr. Jim Ovia, and that's a good move, including the consumer credit scheme, which has been announced, that has a huge potential to catalyze Nigeria's massive consuming power. We commend all of this. We also commend the president's drive to stimulate foreign direct investment. But who will also tell the president and keep reminding him that as the leader of our nation, he must insist on transparency. He must insist on accountability. He must insist on the strict implementation of modalities that discourages impunity, that discourages abuse of power and that discourages corruption. He must insist on curtailing excess on an ongoing basis. And he must continue to desperately push initiatives like he did for student loan initiatives that ensure economic growth, that ensure job creation, and ensure social welfare. Those are the things that he must continue to push very hard. This is because a thriving economy not only improves the living standard of the people, but also uplifts citizens and the nation, while also additionally showcasing Nigeria as a good example in Africa and in the world. And that is why we want those who have the president ears to tell him about some of these critical concerns. And there you have my take for the week. Inside Sources, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Inside Sources. Today we continue the conversation on the future of Nigeria. And I have with me a very eminent Nigerian lawyer and human rights activist, Mr. Clement Nwankwo. Mr. Clement Nwankwo, he is currently the executive director of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center. And he's said to be indeed the first person to start a human rights organization in Nigeria. Mr. Nwankwo, you are welcome to Inside Sources.
Thank you, Laulu. My privilege. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So I just want to start, slightly different today to say that based on what you have represented since 1987, when you guys started the CLO, you've been very active in the area of human rights, in the area of, civil society up until now. So in your view, do you think that from 1999 till date, we have been able to actually get the fruit of civilian rule?
I think the fruit is still hanging quite high. And it looks like each time we try to grow to that height, it keeps being elusive. But certainly, I think we've come some way. If anybody was in this country, living in this country between December 1983 up till 1999, then you would know that there's been a difference. My involvement in human rights started between that period, 1987. But before then, I had seen some of the worst abuse of human rights that any country can witness under General Buhari, who seized power in December 1983. Under General Ibrahim Babangida, who overthrew him in 1985, and then subsequently under General Sani Abacha, who, between the three of them, ran the most brutal dictatorship that this country has ever seen. So if you've come from that years of brutality of military administration and seen the country transit in 1999 to civilian democratic rule, then you will appreciate there's been a difference. And that difference manifests in freedom of speech, manifests in citizens' ability to be creative. Certainly, we have a long way to go. Certainly, we do not believe that we have fully harnessed the potential that this country should have had with civilian democratic rule. In some ways, in some areas, we may even have regressed, but nothing compares with civilian democratic rule. And I say that from the experience that I had, from the experience that colleagues had, from the experience of seeing people brutalized, colleagues killed, colleagues imprisoned. Coming from that perspective, perhaps it's appropriate that since 1999 to date, we can say this is 25 years of democracy. We are not there. We're still a long way away. We're still very critical of this country's ability or inability to harness the full potentials of our democratic government. But certainly, nothing can replace civilian rule.
Okay, interesting. I'd just like to interject, on the issue of the military dictatorship and some of the abuses that we we witnessed, in the 80s and the 90s, like you have rightly recalled. Something happened in this country a couple weeks back, I think sometimes in March, when a military agency arrested a journalist and detained him for 2 weeks, chained him down, put him in a basement because somebody had a problem with the story. Now, I felt that a lot of the media interest groups, NGE, Nigerian Guild of Editors, Nigerian Union of Journalists, International Press Institute, they have spoken against, what they call the militarization of the media space. I raised that to say that there's a lot of concern that kind of behavior, even though it's one-off, hopefully, is still possible in a democratic setting.
Yeah, it is very sad. And for us who are monitoring the human rights situation in Nigeria, and we have been keeping a close eye on the present administration headed by President Tinubu, who came in May of 2023, just under a year ago. We've been keeping an eye on his human rights record. Certainly, some of these incidences will add up to provide a judgment on how he has respected human rights or not. And for such a heinous abuse of rights to occur is certainly a dent on his credentials. But President Tinubu comes from a background of involvement in the fight for democracy, in the fight for human rights. So we believe that this particular incident should be an incident that he should take very, very seriously and ensure that institutions, and the military is an institution of democracy because they provide security and all of these institutions have to operate within the rule of law. And I think no president should be even much more emphatic about respect for human rights than President Tinubu himself. And it's not just the journalist who was imprisoned under very, very harsh conditions and should in fact not have been arrested.
Absolutely.
But also there have been a few more incidents. We saw what happened recently in Okuama and adjoining communities where very sadly, I must say this, that soldiers were killed, but sending soldiers into those communities, sealing off those communities, sending residents of those communities into hiding and into the forest and operating without regard for human rights is unacceptable. The president, even by his own speech, encouraged that to happen. Soldiers have no business maintaining law or peace in a community. They only can come in when the police have said we cannot and we need a backup. So for the soldiers themselves to have gone into that community way ahead of the police is again unacceptable. And the president should never have encouraged that soldiers go into those communities supposedly to carry out the investigation. It's not their responsibility, and the president should not make those types of comments suggesting that soldiers have those powers. So all of these add up to what would be the human rights credentials of this administration. And we expect that President Tinubu, who comes from a background of understanding of the tenets of democracy and human rights, should never have encouraged soldiers to do so. And each time we do these things, we whittle down on the ability of the police to be effective. The police needs to be given support. They need to be equipped to handle even the most difficult conditions. This didn't happen here. And for the future, you really must encourage a situation where the institutions of democracy are charged under the Constitution with maintaining law and order in communities are given their responsibility. So I think that the president, again, failed in that regard. And whatever it is, the police have no powers to arrest, the soldiers, the military have no powers to go into communities and arrest civilians and investigate the commission of a crime. It's unacceptable, it's undemocratic, and should not have been allowed to happen.
Thank you. I mean, very, very important, because those things remind us of the very dark days of military rule. And if you look at it, when we look at what has happened between 1999 and now, like you've rightly said, we say, well, thank God that some of those brutalities are past. But we must point out when somebody tries to remind us of those dark days. Thank you so much for your comment. So to come back to the issue. So if you look at where Nigeria is today, right now, based on what you have also said earlier in your opening comments, do you think that we are on course to greatness, the greater Nigeria that we all imagine?
I think that there are challenges, and I worry about where the trajectory is. Yes, we should celebrate that we have had uninterrupted civilian rule. And this is 25 years this year of civilian administration. We do find that the existence of the legislative arm of government is a symbol of democracy, because each time the military intervenes, the legislature goes. So for us who are working in that space of policy intervention, it's just so good to see that we've had the legislature working for 25 years, and we hope that this continues. But we want to see a more effective legislature. We want to see a more responsive legislature. We want to see a government that also is more responsive to citizens' demands. And that's perhaps part of the challenge that we are faced with. And a lot of people get frustrated by the slow pace of development, by deterioration in civic values, human values, cultural values in this country. The levels of corruption perhaps has gotten worse. The inability to account for resources of the country has gotten worse. Those who have been elected into positions have not focused more on developing of the human system and human life. And for a lot of people, it's actually been very desperate and frustrating. But again, like I said, civilian administration, I think, if a lot of us think back to 1983, when the civilian administration had again been such a huge disappointment, and you had people basically saying, look, we can't continue with this.
Like this. The
consequence was that you had some of the most brutal dictators in the African continent emerge in Nigeria. And development was stultified for so many years. And then if you look at what is going on today, it's the military that created such deterioration in values in this country. So for a lot of us, we believe that it's important that there must be consciousness on the part of those who are leading this country, that they must lead right, and that if they continue on the path that they are going, which is a path of unaccountability, a part of failure to respond to citizens' demands, then we have a threat to continued democracy. But for us who have seen the consequences of failure of democracy, it's a scenario that we dread very much.
Clearly. I mean, and joined to that is in my view, what I see as the insensitivity of government officials. And you see this a lot, and not just in the executive arm of government, but also on the legislative arm of government. So my question is, and if I should describe it, so you have a lot of SSCs. People could imagine that, you could do without that. You have a budget for feeding and personal care getting up to 5 billion. You have legislators, in this kind of hardship, purchasing SUVs, running into, over 100 million per one and stuff like that, which, send the wrong signals, to the people who are being asked to say that, these are tough times. Everybody is tightening their belt and all these things are happening in government. Now, how do you respond, or what's your view about that level of insensitivity among our political elites?
I think the levels of privilege, the levels of entitlement, the levels of aggrandizement in government is incredibly high in Nigeria. And we've seen governments operate in several parts across the world where the levels of prudence are much more curtailed. Levels of prudence are quite high, and the extravagance in government is much more curtailed. I think that in this country, a lot of people who are unable to be creative personally, who are unable to promote individual enterprise, see the public space and public purse as an important avenue to promote their enterprise in government and aggrandize themselves. And this needs to change. And this can only change when those who are in leadership positions, and it has to start from the president. I always say that the person who makes the difference is the president. I always worry when people say, oh, citizens are also not playing their parts. You've got to play your part as the leader of the country, as the leader of government, either at the state or national level.
Yeah.
In order that those around you can take the examples. And I do not understand why you have to spend so much money to house ministers, to buy cars, sometimes 3, 4 cars. Some, of course, you have the backup car, then you have the security cars. And then if you look at the police, for instance, we are told constantly that you have about 400,000 policemen in Nigeria. I can tell you that more than 50% of those policemen are not available for public duty.
Wow, more than 50%?
They are available to individuals who can pay for it, to public officials, and then the rest of the country is left with about 50%, which is grossly inadequate to provide security. And so this creates its own problems. And I think that unless we can cut back on the way in which public officials feast on the public purse, the nature and levels of underdevelopment would be incredibly worsened. The president has come to say that he wants to cut some of this. Of course, we have to see him match his words with action. If you say that public officials should not travel over a given period, let's enforce it. If you say that the president should not have more than X number of persons in his entourage, let's match it. Now, there's nothing wrong with a president going off on a trip and you have 500 people following him. That's not a problem. The problem is this 500 people being paid from the public purse. And we've seen that across the world, that the president is the chief marketer of the country. So if businessmen want to join his entourage, they shouldn't even be allowed to step into the presidential plane. They should buy their tickets. They should make their bookings, and they should arrive at the venue. They shouldn't even be feasted by the embassy or the high commission with public funds.
It's true.
So that's the way it operates in advanced countries. And that's the way that you can curtail the ruthlessness of feasting on the public purse. And there's nothing, I don't think that a lot of these people who are accompanying the president on visits are incapable of paying their way. No.
True.
They can pay their way. And I think that it should be a privilege to them that they join the presidential entourage, but they should pay for being part of that. And their business and reason for accompanying or going to the same destination as the president should be in the national interest.
So Clement, what do you think, how do you think the political elite can get the message in terms of, being more sensitive? And I say that because I am beginning to see, and other people have confirmed this, that the level of hardship and the depth of poverty in our country is beginning to reveal that people they are starting to view anybody that just looks well to do as the enemy. So what do you, and I try to ask my guests this question of what signal ought to be sent to the political elite? How come they are not getting these messages?
I think that because you have the wrong sort of people occupying public office. For them, the end is not to deliver service to citizens. The end is not the ambition of improving the country. The end is actually acquiring that office. And that's why a whole lot of them spend incredibly to get nominated and get into office. And you do have an electoral system in this country that is also very warped. The electoral system has failed the country, and we need to go back into setting up a new electoral system that is able to sift the best into agreeing to run for office. Because quite honestly, you would find that nobody who has the right senses in this country would want to run for elections. Nobody who means well for the country would want to run for elections in Nigeria, simply because the process of emerging as a candidate in an election is so messed up, is so dishonest, is so abused, that nobody who earns his money honestly would want to come out and spend that money. And you find that when people are running for elections, those who control the electoral process are perhaps looking for the worst person to emerge as a candidate. They're not looking for the most brilliant. In fact, the most brilliant is a threat to them. So they look for the weakest candidates, they look for the most malleable candidates, and ensure that the person emerges. And that person, of course, comes with all of the baggage of not knowing what public office is, not having an agenda, not having an objective, and really just focused on reaping the benefits of having supposedly won elections. So the electoral system needs to change. And that electoral system includes those who run elections, because those who run elections have contributed to the deterioration of election system in Nigeria. And so citizens are increasingly losing faith in the electoral process. And as long as citizens lose faith, the very good ones will not come to run for elections. Those who emerge would mostly be people who are coming to profiteer, charlatans, and all manners of people. They take over power, they steal from the public purse, and even before they complete their term, they are stealing for the next elections. So the reality is that we have to go back to the drawing board, and I have no idea how we can achieve this. But like I said, he who is president makes a whole lot of difference. When President Yaradua of blessed memory ran his elections, this country conducted one of the worst elections in Africa in 2007. And I say that repeatedly because I knew and I saw. You had formed the transition monitoring group then? Yes, I had been chair of transition monitoring group. I had left in that position. Transition monitoring group was formed in 1998. We saw that election happen, and I was chair for 2 years. But in 2007, I was involved in election observation, especially with international observers, the NDIs and the rest of that. And we saw that we were waiting at the venue of the collation of results. And only 13 states had sent in their results when the election results were announced. So the election results of 2007 had no correlationship with what was announced. Interesting. And President Yaradua, when he took over, was quite clear to say this election was flawed. And he began a process of reform. And that was what led to the Justice Mohammed Uwais Committee, the Electoral Reform Committee. And one of the members of that committee, Professor Tahiru Jega, was later to be appointed chairman of INEC. And he worked with progressive minds to conduct the elections in 2011 and also conducted elections in 2015. And 2015 was when you saw, for the first time in Nigeria, an incumbent concede the loss of elections. And, you know, whatever we say of President Jonathan, we must give him we must commend his courage and his leadership. And his patriotism. And patriotism. But we saw, of course, that those who won elections in 2015 began to abuse that process that brought them into office. And we saw under General Muhammadu Buhari how much this country was run aground.
Well,
and of course, we saw what happened with elections in 2023. That elections in 2023 was also very badly organized. In comparison, you might say similar to the way that 2007 was conducted.
So do you think that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu should come out and talk about his own vision for electoral reform? I think it was the Yaga event earlier this week where they were saying that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has said nothing about, whether he will support electoral reforms or not. What do you think he should do?
I think certainly the President Tinubu has an opportunity. And nothing says he can't contest elections in 2027. Maybe even if he was to embark on serious reforms, both in terms of governance reforms, but also electoral reforms, that could actually be his moment to emerge as a truly great leader of this country. He must acknowledge that the elections in 2023 was a failure in terms of the quality of it, in terms of its delivery. For the first time in this country, we saw battles being waged on the streets where people were being forced back into their houses because of their ethnic origins, where people were being attacked because particular ethnic groups in certain parts of the country were not being allowed to vote. I think the president has a wonderful opportunity of saying, look, we must reform our electoral process. And there are very many recommendations that have come through on how you can reform the electoral process. Justice Waze's committee, the ERC report, outlined several things to be done. Senator Kenan Amani headed a committee on consumer electoral reform. I was a part of that committee. Reform suggestions were made. Even President Jonathan, in the dying days of his administration, also proposed reforms through the committee that he set up. I think that this president needs to agree that something needs to be done. You already have seen the rhetoric of one of the chairmen of the parties saying that there is no vacancy in Aso Rock in 2027. Those are not things that anybody should be saying. I can understand that he's politicking, but from the ruling party, it's not the kind of words you use as politics because of the implications and interpretations that can be given to those types of rhetorics. Very,
very, I agree entirely with that. But specifically speaking, do you think that it is right and proper to have the chairman of the electoral body, the independent national electoral body, to be chosen by the president?
I think that there have been suggestions about how the process should be, and this is contained in Justice Uwezi's report on how nominations can be made. Nigeria and Kenya had a similar experience in 2007 when elections were conducted in both countries. In Kenya, it was terrible. There were killings, violence, to the point that the person who emerged as president in Kenya stood trial at The Hague.
Yes. True.
And he attended, he said, look, I'm going to attend the trial. He attended the trial. He was not convicted. And then he came back and decided to embark on meaningful reforms. And those reforms covered the entire gamut of institutions of democracy, including the judiciary. Most of the judges were sacked in Kenya. The Supreme Court was reconstituted.
Of the reforms.
Yes, as a result of the reforms. And the person who became Chief Justice of Kenya, a good friend of mine who were involved in the African Continental Human Rights Movement, was voted upon to become the Chief Justice of Kenya.
Interesting.
So we have not gone back to the drawing board to tell ourselves the truth. And until we tell ourselves the truth, we would find that the system will continue to be manipulated and it will continue to deteriorate. So this country needs to come to the point where It recognizes that its institutions are failing. The judiciary is losing public trust and confidence.
Yeah.
And the electoral system is virtually grinding to a halt. And if we don't make reforms following from the experience of 2023, and we say we're going to elections in 2027, I really worry for the country.
So one of the things that emerged in the 2023 was the question of the extent to which the electronic method of, is it now collating, was done. And INEC had promised, what it was going to do. They didn't do it. The Supreme Court says that they didn't have to do it. Do you think that there is something else that can be done in terms of the wording of the Electoral Act that can actually deliver, better results in terms of the credibility of the process, to create trust,
I think the legitimacy of government is always very important. And that legitimacy means that it must be conferred by the people. If an election petition has to go to court over the way an election is conducted, the courts need to be able to examine the true ramifications of the issues and give a judgment that confers legitimacy on an administration. Where people don't see that, the legitimacy will continue to dog that administration. And there's so much that legitimacy does for a government.
Yeah.
It can mobilize people in support. It can help you to get the best knowledge and best information that enables you to run a government. There's nothing that says that you have to appoint political associates to be your ministers. If you really want to bring about change, you have to find the best brains. A lot of us have seen the huge deterioration in supply of electricity in this country. Some sections of the most, I don't even want to say come in towns, but some section of the most privileged parts of town go for days without electricity.
Those are the band A people.
The band A people don't have electricity. In my house, I've not had electricity for more than 24 hours as we're speaking now.
Wow.
In my office for more than, and there's no fault. It's just that there's no electricity to supply. So there's a lot that goes into legitimacy of a government. And we must reform if we are to get things right. And like I said, the president has a huge opportunity of creating a name for himself. Sometimes if elections don't confer legitimacy on you, your actions
can do that.
Can do that.
True.
And make you a true hero. And I think that's what we need to see happen in this country. Otherwise, we would still be at the rudimentary stages of development. And if you look at what is going on, I was watching a news item this morning where a community leader was saying that they no longer can go to the farm. They have to pay bandits
to do that.
To do their farming.
I read that too. So one of the things that distinguishes a democratic rule, just like you said before, is the fact that there is a parliament. Okay. Now, if we look at what we have had since 1999, there are a lot of observations around the fact that the legislature has not really hand its place as the people's house, because for the most part, it is viewed as essentially a rubber stamp of the ruling government. And also that even those that are in opposition in the legislature, for instance, right now, the PDP, they're supposed to be in opposition, they too are completely knocked out. I mean, look at what happened when they were trying to constitute some of the membership of the electoral commissions, around the country. And you had politicians proposing right from the president, to some of the other politicians that are well known, Akpabio putting his people there, somebody that served under him. I think Wike, the same thing, putting politicians, people that are known to have served them directly as members of electoral commissions. And the opposition in the parliament was completely silent. What's your take on that?
I think sometimes people do not act on issues because they think ultimately they will benefit from it. The Nigerian political system is such now that the distinction between political parties has become so hazy. And so, and because, people have moved, if you look at the parties, APC, who is in APC? Several of them were in PDP. And it just goes on. Somebody loses an election, he jumps to the next political party. You see members of parliament, of the legislature, say they have decamped from their party to another party. When the constitution is very clear, you can't do that unless under certain circumstances.
Right.
So the beliefs, and that's the point I make about the military intervention in 1983. You couldn't have people decamp from one party to the other. If you are able to look back to history, the two governors who had in fact decamped was Abubakar Rimi in Kano.
Right.
But he moved to another political party to enable him run for a second term as governor.
Right.
And in Kaduna, of course, Balarabe Musa was impeached. But you couldn't do that then. You couldn't move parties.
Yeah.
But
now,
today, the constitutional provisions regarding this have been
observed
have been abused. And so, given that situation that members have no loyalties to political parties, the political system is crumbling. In the 80s, you would see the UPN headed by Chief Obafemi Awolowo.
Right.
He had alternative programs and views.
Right.
And never could have compromised with the ruling National Party of Nigeria, the MPN. They had their views. Today, you don't know who is in what political party.
Yeah.
And so the whole issue of ideology, beliefs, and so on has disappeared. But you must go back to a situation where the levels of impunity do not allow for people to want to become a part of the ruling party, believing that being a part of the ruling party, they can do what they like. That's what is crumbling the political party system today. As long as there's impunity, as long as you feel that if you are in the ruling party, you are protected, then the country's democracy will continue to survive. The system must also protect the opposition, must also make it possible for the opposition to run an election in a free and fair political environment.
Yeah.
That is not happening.
Because you have, they've just had the local government elections, and what you have is the ruling party in the state.
No, there are no local government elections in Nigeria. And, if you go back to, that's the point also I make about the way that INEC is constituted. And this came through from the reports of several observers. The whole question about appointment of membership of INEC.
Right.
And then even appointment of resident electoral commissioners.
Yeah.
And some of the observer groups have said, look, you don't need to have resident electoral commissioners appointed by the president or nominated by the president and confirmed by the legislature. They are running elections in the states, which is controlled by the INEC. So INEC should have the duty of appointing those to manage election in the states. And I totally agree with that you really don't have a need for recs, because a lot of elections are wrecked by them.
Interesting.
So those are conversations that came through from several election observation reports that we must take very seriously in reforming our electoral process. You don't need a rec to run an election in the states, because they become part and parcel of the state infrastructure and become loyal to governors in the states. And what is happening, of course, is that a lot of governors, when they see that a tenure of a rec is coming to an end, are the ones who nominate replacements. So the whole idea of a rec is a big problem for elections.
So talking about governors, as we begin to round up, you see a lot of very curious stuff happening in the states. The local governments are for the most part, moribund. There is an ongoing controversy even about the revenue, so the allocation that comes from the federal to the state that's meant to go to the local government. State governments are supposed to have a joint account where they put that revenue and what they also want to contribute. But for the most part, that is not happening. The governors, for the most part, are just doing whatever it is that they like. Now, what does that say about how the states, the federating units of these countries, units are being run? A lot of the times we focus on the president, and for good reasons, like you said, the leadership is very critical, whatever the president does. But what about what the governors are doing?
I think it is tragic what is going on in the States. And I use that word very, very clearly, intending to use it. A lot of governors have become emperors in the States. And it's not just a whole question about local government reforms. The National Assembly and indeed the constitutional reform process passed amendments that gave state houses of assembly. So if you're complaining about the National Assembly, let's talk about the state houses of assembly as well.
True.
There was an occasion, I think, where a governor had delivered a speech in the State House of Assembly presenting the state budget, took the gavel and hit it and said the budget is passed.
Are you serious?
Yeah. So
where was that?
I wouldn't mention the state, but
wow.
But clearly, the abuse at the state level is incredible.
Yeah.
Governors have become emperors. They have no respect for the judiciary. They have no respect for the legislature. They carry on with impunity. And sometimes when you look at the states, you are happy that at least you have a federal government that responds. And, whatever you say of President Tinubu, my sense of his administration is, look at the case of the journalist. As soon as that became a public issue, that was responded to. But in the States, nobody.
Yeah, we wouldn't even find out.
Nobody would find out. We had a human rights case of the human rights activist in Cross River, Agba Jalingo, who was targeted by the state governor to the point that he was targeted and persecuted even for criticizing the governor's relation.
Oh, yeah.
And held in prison. So there is...
I think it was even sentenced, wasn't it?
No, he wasn't sentenced. He kept going on and on, but he was detained for years. And that was a case that we pursued. And it's not just the only one.
Yeah.
So you do have a problem with governors. And that's why when some of them leave office and they begin to be called to account, they begin to run and hide.
Exactly.
So you do have a problem.
So what do we have to do?
I think that we really have to empower the state legislatures.
Okay.
We need to protect the judiciary to be independent. Unfortunately, the judiciary has its own conversation around how the judiciary can be recovered from where it has descended into. But we have to know that these are the two institutions that act against oppression and dictatorship and work to support it. And it's the same principle that guides the work that we do, even with the National Assembly, to know that in the absence of the National Assembly, whatever the criticism we have of the National Assembly, in its absence, you have a dictatorship. And in all of my years of human rights work, I can tell the difference. I can tell the difference between what happened between 1983 to 1999 and the brutality of the executive. And the moderating factor. President Obasanjo, in all of his power, was moderated by the National Assembly.
True. Especially during the third term.
Exactly. So we must go back to seeing how can we get the state houses of assembly to be respectable and respected. How do we get our elections right? How do we ensure that the right people, the governor does not just like they do with local governments,
unpick.
choose who the candidates are for State House of Assembly,
Yeah.
and give directives and instructions.
Yeah, in a particular instance, a very good friend of ours, a former governor whose name we will protect, boasted publicly that he was the one that paid for the nomination form of the governor and all members of the assembly. And he felt that he thought it was a gallant of honor. And
that he's not the only one who's done that. We had the case in Edo State, and this has just been particular now, where the governor refused to allow the state legislature to function throughout its selected tenure.
Yeah. Incredible. Anyway, just so as we begin to wrap up, probably this is the last question. So I wanted us to talk about the governor before we now go to the state police, final theme today. I support state police very much because I think that we have gotten to a point where we cannot depend on one centralized police, which itself is not even doesn't even have enough troops on the ground. But the fact that we can't wait, somebody in Ibadan shouldn't wait for somebody to give a command in Abuja. I believe that if we break down the levels of authority in the states and give them enough equipment and adequate support, that we can begin to deal with some of the security challenges. But I have a big concern about how that state police is going to be managed. I don't want a situation, and many Nigerians don't want a situation where the governors are just going to turn this thing to a complete mess. Mr. Nwankwo, you have been working very actively on this subject, I know. How can we prevent a situation where the governors don't control the state police in such a way as to make a nonsense of it? Because that potential is very, very stark.
Yes, it is stark. It is worrying. I think that the sense in which sometimes people say we are federating units, we're not federating units. And so when we're talking of state police, we should be talking about state policing rather than state police. States were arbitrarily created by military governments in this country. True. Sometimes very unequally, sometimes very unfairly. And we know regions in this country who are complaining about how states are skewed against them in terms of the number of states.
Yes.
So states are not federating units in this country.
So we don't have federating units. Really,
federating units are people who come together.
They're supposed to be.
We didn't come together.
And our constitution does not recognize. That's my point. I get the point that federating units are people, nations, but our constitution only recognizes the constitution, just to back your point.
Yes. So I totally believe that it's important that state policing should be instituted in this country. And what that means is, how do you create units of law enforcement, maintenance institutions that has the ability to take decisions to carry out its constitutional role of maintaining law and order
in each of the states.
In each of the states, without the need for those state units of police to receive authorization before they buy paper and pen, before they deploy persons. Or if they deploy persons, can be summoned to bring into the center, into the federal police, control of how investigations are handled. That, I think, is very key. And the idea also, when you go to the Southeast, for instance, that's one of the deficiencies of the current policing system.
Right.
You find almost every single kilometer, you find police and military checkpoints. Most of those who are in those checkpoints are not from the region. So what are they doing? They basically are exploiting and creating tolls to steal from the people. Now, that's part of the anger against the current structure of policing that this country has. And you must get to the point where you would create semi-autonomous or independent police units in the states, give them full powers, equip them, but ensure that they're not under the command and control of state governors.
Very important.
Because when you put them, you see what the governors have done with local governments, how they have ruined the system of local governments.
Completely.
You see how they have run aground the constitutional body known as the State House of Assembly. If you now put a state police under the command and control of governors, you will have a situation. And we go back to the Second Republic. You saw where there were even attempts by some governors in the Second Republic. There were famous incidents. The Mkpo Junction battle between senatorial candidate Emeka Odumegwu Ojukwu was running under MPN and who had the federal police behind him, and Governor Jim Obodo, who was governor of Anambra State at the time, where their security forces clashed and were shooting at each other. So we must avoid those types of situations where we empower already emperor-like governors from
people call them monarchs,
becoming much more able to abuse power. But certainly the discussion around state policing is very crucial. And I think it's going to be the work of the National Assembly to ensure that we do have a state policing system that is safe from abuse, but also responds to the security demands of the states in a way that keeps them independent and free from the normal types of political abuse and partisanship.
That we have. Interesting. Thank you so much. I like the difference that you established between state police and state policing. Because I have been really troubled. I mean, I am an advocate of state police. I believe that we have to decentralize the police control. But I've been really concerned, and a lot of people have expressed concern. You know, those who even push back, they say that, look, do you know what you guys are advocating? You're going to make those governors, you know, the way things are, you know, and that have caused quite a bit of worry. So we have to spend a lot of time to ensure that, like you call it, state policing is what we are calling for, in a way that does not inure to abuse. You know, thank you so much, Mr. Clement Nwankwo, for coming to Inside Sources. Thank you for your years of active service to the country in the human rights community. I told you that, you know, when I was in school in the late 80s, you know, I was following what you were doing in CLO and CRP. Thank you for coming to Inside Sources, and thank you for your service to the country.
Thank you, Laulu. Very much appreciated being here.
Thank you. Thank you. And that is another edition of Inside Sources this week. We believe in Nigeria. That is why we are here. That is why we are pushing the issues. So hashtag Nigeria will survive. Hashtag Nigeria will prevail. My name is Laulu Akonde, and by the grace of God, I'll see you again next week. Thank you for watching.